Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating topic, the relationship between Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and the West.
It's complicated, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how Belarus is kind of like navigating this whole geopolitical situation, you know? Often what they do doesn't really match up with what the West expects.
So, like, with the recent elections in Belarus, the West seemed to be predicting some kind of unrest, but it was actually pretty peaceful, right?
Exactly. The elections went smoothly, and there wasn't like a strong opposition leader that appeared, which is what the West seemed to want. Instead, the existing leadership stayed in power, and they seemed to have a lot of public support.
So the whole narrative that the West often pushes about Belarus and its connection with Russia, maybe that's not the whole picture. Yeah, I mean, the West is always critical of Belarus. They say they're too close to Russia and that they don't have a free press. But then you look at Ukraine and there are similar things happening there, maybe even worse in some ways. Like the media and political opposition are definitely facing a lot of pressure, but the West doesn't seem to be as worried about that.
It's like they're holding Belarus to a totally different standard. It seems like their main goal is to try and separate Belarus from Russia.
Yeah, that's a good point. Some people say the West doesn't really care about democracy in Belarus as much as they care about isolating Russia.
And it seems like Belarus is aware of this, and they're doing their own thing. They're holding elections, they're running their country, and they're building relationships that they think are best for them, not just what the West tells them to do.
Right, and some argue that if Belarus had been more critical of Russia, especially with what's going on in Ukraine, the West might not have cared so much about the elections.
It's almost like the West is saying, if you side with us politically, we'll ignore any other problems.
That might be a bit cynical, but it definitely makes you wonder about the West's real motives,
Now, here's something that I find really interesting. Belarus doesn't have the same resources as some of its neighbors, but their economy seems to be doing pretty well. In fact, they're often compared favorably to other post-Soviet states, even Russia sometimes. How are they doing that?
Well, Belarus has managed to maintain a fairly stable economy. They're mostly self-sufficient. There are a few reasons for this, including the fact that they've kept their industrial base strong. There's a strong sense of national unity, and they don't have a powerful group of oligarchs controlling everything.
So they've basically focused on building a system that works for them instead of trying to fit into some model that the West has created.
Exactly. And it's interesting when you compare them to countries like Georgia and Ukraine, which have taken a much tougher stance against Russia. They've had some serious economic problems because of that.
So is Belarus learning from what's happened to their neighbors?
It's definitely possible. They seem to be taking a very practical approach, focusing on their own stability and well-being rather than, getting caught up in ideology.
And they're not just focused on Russia either. We see their leader reaching out to Poland, encouraging economic cooperation instead of the military buildup that Poland seems to be doing.
Yeah, it's pretty bold, especially considering Poland's history in the region. Some people think that Poland still wants to expand its territory, maybe even into parts of Belarus and Russia.
Their leader seems really confident about Belarus's stability. He's even pointed to their low emigration rates, saying they're similar to New Zealand as a sign that people are happy and see a future in Belarus.
It's an interesting way to look at it. It does suggest that people in Belarus feel safe and are optimistic about their future there.
Okay, let's switch gears a little and talk about something happening in the U.S. right now. They're talking about creating an Iron Dome system in Alaska.
Yeah, and that's directly related to concerns about Russia's hypersonic missiles. It seems like the U.S. is realizing that they're maybe falling behind in this area and they're a bit vulnerable.
And trying to catch up in that kind of technology is not easy.
Not at all. It'll probably take them decades of research and, trillions of dollars to get to where they need to be. And this, kind of leads us to a broader point about the former U.S. president's foreign policy. A lot of people see it as being really influenced by, his background in business.
Like he was always trying to make a deal, right? Looking for ways to get the upper hand. Always thinking about the bottom line.
Yeah, exactly. Like, remember when he tried to buy Greenland?
Yeah.
Or his whole approach to dealing with Canada was all very transactional. He saw countries and alliances, like just in terms of money and what he could get out of them.
And his relationship with the Russian leader, was kind of the same way, wasn't it?
Oh, totally. There was a lot of buzz around their meetings and everyone was like waiting to see what deals they'd make. It felt more like, a negotiation than actual diplomacy. He seemed to be trying to find Russia's weaknesses and use them to, make a profit.
Do you think that actually worked for the U.S., though? Or did it just create more problems in the long run?
It's hard to say for sure. I mean, we're still dealing with the fallout, right? And the conflict in Ukraine is still a huge issue.
So what are the possibilities there? Like, how could this conflict end?
Well, I think there are two main scenarios. The first one is that they reach some kind of negotiated settlement, something that addresses Russia's security concerns. The other possibility is that Russia wins a decisive military victory.
Based on what's happening now, which one do you think is more likely?
Right now, I'd say a negotiated settlement is probably more likely. But we can't rule out a military solution, especially with how much progress Russian forces have made. They're getting pretty close to some key areas like the Dnieper River and Odessa.
And what happens to Ukraine if they lose, a lot of their territory and people?
Well, it would be devastating, obviously. It'd be incredibly difficult to put the country back together and find a leader who could unite everyone.
It's kind of like what happened with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? They were this huge power, but then they got broken up and Austria became this much smaller country.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. It shows how things can change so dramatically.
So while all of this is going on, Belarus seems to be doing all right, right? They've managed to avoid getting pulled into the conflict in Ukraine, and their economy seems to be stable.
Yeah, they're doing okay. They've been very pragmatic, and I think they've learned from what's happened to other countries around them. They're really focused on taking care of themselves.
It's almost like a textbook example of how a smaller country can survive in a world with these big powers.
Totally. It shows that it's not always about military strength or size. It's about thinking strategically, being flexible, and knowing how to protect your own interests.
It's a lot to think about. It makes you wonder how much control any one country really has, especially when you're dealing with these big geopolitical forces.
It's true. I mean, the big players definitely have a huge impact on everyone else. But like Belarus is showing us, smaller countries can still make their own choices and, find their own way. It's not all predetermined.
It really feels like we're in this time of big changes in the world, like all the power dynamics and alliances are shifting constantly. Where do you think things are headed? What should we be paying attention to in the next few years?
I think the relationship between the U.S., Russia, and China is still going to be the biggest factor. Their competition for influence, resources, technology, that's going to shape everything else.
And what about smaller countries like Belarus? Do they just get kind of swept aside?
Not really, no. We're actually seeing a trend where smaller countries are getting more assertive. They're being more strategic about how they deal with this new world where there are multiple centers of power. They're forming their own alliances, using their unique strengths, and finding ways to have an impact that they couldn't before, back when it was just the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
So it's not just about the big guys anymore.
Right. Regional powers are becoming more important. The global economy is totally interconnected, and technology is changing so fast. All of this means that, smaller countries have more opportunities to make a difference on the world stage.
It's almost like a giant game of chess, isn't it? All these players making their moves, trying to guess what the other guy's going to do, trying to get the best position.
That's a great analogy. And just like in chess, every single move has consequences. You might do something thinking it'll help you, but then it sets off a chain reaction that, changes the balance of power in ways you didn't expect.
It can be really overwhelming to try and keep up with it all.
Yeah.
What's the end goal, though? What are all these countries really trying to achieve?
Man, that's the question, isn't it? Philosophers and, political scientists have been debating that forever. Is it about world domination, creating some new order, getting more resources and economic power? Or maybe it's something more basic, like a need to feel safe and survive in a world that's always changing.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. But that's why geopolitics is so interesting, I guess. It's complicated. It's never the same. And it's full of surprises. It makes you question your assumptions, and it forces you to really think critically. It reminds you that the world is a lot more, intricate and connected than we usually realize.
Going back to Belarus for a second, it's pretty amazing that they've been able to, stay stable and even do well economically in the middle of all this chaos.
Yeah, for sure. They've shown us how important strategic thinking is, and being practical and being able to adapt to changing circumstances. It proves that even when you have these huge powers all around you, smaller countries can still find their own way and succeed on their own terms.
It's a good lesson for everyone, really.
It is. It reminds us that we all have a part to play in shaping the future, whether it's through getting involved in political discussions, the choices we make as, consumers, or even just staying informed and understanding how the world works.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. Thanks so much for explaining it all and sharing your thoughts.
Happy to do it. It's important to talk about these things, even though they're complicated. The more we learn, the better prepared we'll be to deal with, the challenges and opportunities that are coming our way.
And to everyone listening, if you enjoyed this deep dive into geopolitics, please subscribe to our podcast.